Angelina Rodriguez had never been one to settle down.
She didn't seem to stay with men for very long.
Her love life was like a revolving door.
But then she met Frank.
He was head over heels.
And within months, they were married.
They fell in love so deeply.
But then, just 5 months after the wedding, Frank came down with a sudden illness.
About 7:30, he started crying.
And 56 hours later, he was dead.
How did my brother die? The medical examiners were stumped.
Was it payback for an old grudge?
She's telling me someone's poisoned your brother.
This man is a psycho.
Or was Angelina looking for a payday?
$250,000.
The search for the truth would be a crazy ride full of double crosses,
Angelina doesn't know that the joke's on her.
secret tapes,
Something's happened to your friend.
Everybody in jail is looking for a deal.
and a final reveal that would rip the mask off a monster.
Cold-hearted killer. The term truly applies.
Montebello, California, September 9th, 2000. It was the middle of the night in this quiet community of 60,000 in Southern California, San Gabriel Valley.
It's east of Los Angeles. It's very suburban, middle class.
But then, at a little after 3 o'clock that morning, Los Angeles County 911 received an urgent call from 32-year-old Angelina Rodriguez.
Angelina said that she found her husband face down on the floor, and he wasn't breathing.
Paramedics and officers from the Montebello Police Department rushed to the scene. And when they arrived, they found 41-year-old Frank Rodriguez collapsed on the floor beside the couple's bed.
When first responders got there, they found Frank in a terrible condition. There was blood coming out of his nose.
And when the paramedics checked his pulse, they discovered that Frank Rodriguez was dead. But what had killed him? According to Angelina, Frank had been ill recently.
She explained to them that for the past few days, Frank was having severe stomach issues.
So severe, in fact, that she said Frank had been briefly hospitalized less than 48 hours earlier.
Angelina herself had actually taken Frank to the hospital.
According to Angelina, the doctors had suspected her husband was suffering from a stomach bug, or perhaps a bad case of food poisoning.
They told Angelina, take him home and give him as many fluids as possible and just hope that it passes.
But instead, it was her husband who had passed, and the investigators' search for answers in his mysterious death would raise a surprising number of questions about his wife, Angelina. Born in 1968, Angelina grew up in the blue-collar community of Rockaway Beach, New York, though her childhood had been anything but pleasant.
There was not a lot of affection and bonding, attachment, regard for the members of the family.
They had a father who was truly an absent father.
When Angelina was a toddler, her father left the family altogether, so her mother had to work long hours at 2 jobs to support Angelina and her sister.
Angelina's mother was constantly gone. Her mother was always working.
And since daycare wasn't really an option for the struggling single mom, she often left Angelina and her sister in the care of their grandfather, who practically raised the 2 girls.
She was really looking for attention, and she found that in her grandfather.
As she grew up, Angelina kept on looking for attention.
She was a social butterfly.
It just went from one boy to the next, and then eventually from one man to the next.
Right after high school, Angelina married a man who was a neighbor. But like all her other relationships, it didn't last long.
Her love life was like a revolving door. And I think it was just her way of getting attention and getting love.
She was capable of having relationships, romantic relationships, but they were only on a superficial level.
It was the same pattern, repeated over and over.
all of Angelina's relationships. They started quickly and they ended quickly.
In May of 1990, at the age of 21, she married for a second time. And this time the relationship looked like it might last. First, Angelina and her husband settled in the central California town of Paso Robles.
Paso Robles is in the central coast of California. It's known for its vineyards. It's just gorgeous. It's picturesque.
Angelina and her new husband also had 2 little girls, one in 1990 and the other 2 years later.
She was described by everybody as being a devoted parent who enjoyed being with her children and laughing and playing with them.
But then, in 1993, her youngest daughter died.
Her daughter choked on a pacifier.
These pacifiers have been recalled because of either deterioration or failure.
The tragic loss took a frightful toll on Angelina and her marriage.
Angelina was quite devastated. She became quite depressed.
And by 1994, Angelina had both divorced for a second time and fallen back into her old familiar pattern of short, failed relationships.
Those relationships did not work out for one reason or another.
By the year 2000, she had even married and divorced a third time.
She didn't seem to stay with men for very long.
However, not long after her third divorce, while working at a National Guard facility, the 31-year-old met someone who finally offered the stability that her life had been missing, Frank Rodriguez. 9 years older than Angelina, Frank had grown up in Connecticut, part of a tight-knit family.
I just loved him to pieces. He was just so cute.
He was kind of my protector at school when he had a couple friends that liked me but wouldn't let me date them. We were really close.
After high school, Frank married his hometown sweetheart and joined the Navy.
He loved the Navy. He saw Japan, he saw Alaska. He enjoyed what he was doing, serving the country.
But his long absences at sea also took a toll on Frank's marriage.
His first wife was not happy that he was continually leaving for 6-month stints.
In 1995, after 14 years of marriage, Frank divorced. Ironically, by then, Frank had left the Navy to pursue a teaching degree.
He started going to college, in fact, went into the National Guard while he was working on his degree.
And his Guard service, combined with his passion for teaching, led to a job at a National Guard facility called Angel Gate Academy.
Angel Gate was like a camp for at-risk youth.
He felt he could make a difference in troubled kids' lives.
And in February of 2000, Frank noticed someone new in the office, Angelina.
She was an attention grabber and she was a looker.
Frank soon asked her out, and before long, they were dating.
They had gone on their first date around Valentine's Day, and he was head over heels in love with her.
In Angelina, Frank saw something he had always wanted, a family.
She already had a daughter. She was already a mother. For Frank, this was like hitting the lottery.
Angelina, never one to move slowly in a relationship, fell just as quickly for Frank.
They fell in love so deeply that they married within 3 months. They met in February and were married by April.
And within days of the wedding on April 8th, the couple left Angelina's longtime home of Paso Robles behind and moved 200 miles to the south to the town of Montebello, California.
He was starting the job with the school district.
The move was tough on Angelina.
She doesn't know anybody. She doesn't have a job. Her friends are miles and miles away.
Frank, on the other hand, appeared happy to be making a fresh start.
He just seemed to be so excited to be able to be there.
He had the beautiful wife. He had the instant family. He couldn't have asked for more.
But how long would he enjoy it? On Wednesday, September 6, 2000, 5 months after the wedding, Frank began feeling sick at work.
Frank had come home from work complaining of stomach pain.
It was very unusual for Frank.
He didn't have any health concerns that I was aware of. He was a very healthy guy.
But by the next morning, the pain had gotten so bad that he agreed to let Angelina drive him to the hospital.
Frank came into the hospital complaining of severe stomach pain.
The ER doctors weren't all that concerned, though.
He had been told by the doctor that he just had flu.
That or a simple case of food poisoning. Either way, the hospital sent him home after a brief examination.
The medical advice was for him to drink a lot of fluids and to rest in bed.
Angelina could not have been a better nurse. She cared for him nonstop. She was at his bedside 24 hours.
Right up to the moment, less than 48 hours later, when Frank fell out of his bed and died. In the early morning hours of Saturday, September 9th, 2000, police and paramedics rushed to the Montebello, California home of Angelina and Frank Rodriguez.
Angelina herself called 911 and told police that her husband was found face down on the floor and he wasn't breathing.
And by the time the paramedics arrived, the 41-year-old Navy veteran was dead.
My mom called me. I was at work, and she was hysterical. And she said that Frank was dead.
It was shocking. It's like surreal.
It was also quite a mystery.
How did my brother die as a healthy young man?
According to what Angelina told the first responders, Frank had been ill for the past few days.
Frank had actually been in the hospital just 48 hours before, having severe stomach pain.
Although despite the severe pain, the doctors had dismissed Frank's illness as a simple stomach bug or possibly food poisoning.
They sent him home and told him to consume as many fluids as possible.
Had his doctors missed something? The autopsy provided no answers.
The medical examiner was really stumped at Frank's death.
It's not very clear how he died. There are no wounds.
And the toxicology tests all came back negative.
The coroner had run all the standard tests on Frank's body. There were no standard drugs or any types of things like that.
They really did not have that cause of death.
Angelina had a few ideas, though. Once the autopsy was complete, she contacted the authorities, concerned about the results.
She wanted to make sure that she was doing everything possible to push this along, to get the answers that everyone was looking for.
And according to Angelina, she had reason to be concerned. On September 14th, 3 days after the autopsy, the 32-year-old sat down with investigators from the LA County Sheriff's Department and told them she believed that Frank had been murdered.
You have some information or believe there's a possibility that your husband was poisoned.
Angelina told the investigators that she suspected one of Frank's former co-workers at Angel Gate Academy, the boot camp for at-risk youth.
This man is a psycho.
Angelina told investigators that this former co-worker had abused kids while working at the academy.
Not only had he allegedly been abusing the kids, Angelina said that she and Frank had reported it.
Once you see the reports that were filed, that were initiated by Frank and myself, that's how all of this started.
However, Angelina said that their superiors at Angel Gate had dismissed those reports.
And I was just appalled. I was just like, how can you just let him walk around here?
According to Angelina, she and Frank had been so disgusted by the situation that he'd started looking for a new job. But even after he got the job in Montebello and they had moved more than 200 miles to the south, Angelina said they hadn't put the trouble at Angel Gate entirely behind them. Frank still occasionally went to Angel Gate and in fact was there just days before he died.
Frank had gone up there the week before to have a meeting.
Okay, when was this?
Tuesday.
Angelina said that Frank had thought nothing of it at the time.
When I get back, I said, so how is everybody there? They were great. They walked up to me. They hugged me. They missed me. It felt like I was at home. There was no animosity.
Or was there? According to Angelina, the next day, Frank had come home from work feeling ill.
He looked a little flushed, and I thought, well, okay, maybe he's just tired.
That night, Frank became violently ill, unable to keep anything down.
About 7:30, he started throwing up. That's Wednesday night.
Angelina said she had urged Frank to go to the emergency room.
He goes, no, I probably just got drunk.
But by the next morning, Angelina said that Frank's condition had become so bad that she had insisted they go to the hospital.
Obviously, Angelina's alarmed.
So I take him in and I said, he's sick. I don't know what it is. He's sick. He can't stand, he can't talk. I said, he's throwing up.
The doctors checked him out, but weren't quite sure what had made Frank sick.
The diagnosis was something akin to gastroenteritis. Food poisoning was also discussed.
Angelina said that the doctors had sent Frank home with a prescription for anti-nausea medicine and instructions for Angelina to push fluids, which she did.
I had him jugging water. I'm thinking the worst is over.
But it wasn't.
She couldn't seem to help him get better.
By Saturday, less than 3 days after his symptoms began, Frank was dead. The sudden mystery illness left Angelina convinced that Frank had been poisoned.
I don't know what else it could be. I mean, for him being as healthy as he was, and for it to come from this strong man to, you know, it just seemed over what, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday?
And the fact that it had come so soon after his visit to Angel Gate couldn't be a coincidence in Angelina's mind.
There's somebody in the office that am I hungry or thirsty, and gave me Gatorade and cookies.
Angelina said she didn't know exactly who had given Frank the food.
Ever end up telling you who offered him the Gatorade and something?
Somebody in the office.
Somebody in the office.
Okay.
But she claimed to have a good idea. The man they'd reported for having inappropriate relations with a student.
He's the one that threatened Frank. It was just it's too hard for me to fathom anything else.
The investigators told Angelina they would look into it. And then, before wrapping up the interview, Angelina asked if the investigators could speed things up as far as settling the cause of death.
I mean, is there any way that you can push him?
Angelina was getting a little impatient. She asked what the holdup was with Frank's body.
After all, she had a funeral to plan.
It's going to be a full military burial at the Riverside National Cemetery.
Not that Angelina necessarily acted like someone planning her husband's funeral a mere 5 months after their marriage.
She did not seem at all upset. She didn't come across as the typical grieving widow that someone, you know, just devastated because they've just lost their spouse. She didn't come across that way at all. She was very cool, very calm, had, you know, explanations for how everything happened and what she was going to do.
Why wasn't Angelina more upset over Frank's death? When the investigators spoke with his sisters, they suggested that it was because the couple's 5-month marriage hadn't been a happy one.
It seemed like it was starting to turn sour pretty quickly.
The trouble had started soon after the couple moved to Montebello.
She feels isolated from the life that she knew and loved.
Although according to Frank's family, she wasn't that isolated.
She had maintained her old apartment.
In fact, even after the move to Montebello, Angelina had spent most of her weekends in Paso Robles without Frank.
She and her daughter would leave and leave Frank at home. So I think it was deteriorating pretty quickly.
Angelina was absent so much that Frank had quickly started worrying.
He confided in his mother. He had major concerns.
He was very close to his pastor at his church. He'd go there and speak with him a lot about how to improve his marriage.
And if a troubled marriage wasn't enough to make investigators look twice at Frank's mysterious death, They soon uncovered evidence she'd taken an insurance policy out on Frank in July of 2000, barely 2 months before he'd fallen ill.
The life insurance policy taken out on Frank was $250,000.
And the investigators couldn't help but wonder, was that the real reason why Angelina wanted them to push things along?
In order for them to pay Angelina, they would need to know the cause of Frank's death.
By the end of September 2000, it had been 3 weeks since 32-year-old Angelina Rodriguez's husband, Frank, had died mysteriously in the couple's Montebello, California home. The death had come barely 5 months after their wedding, and less than 48 hours after a sudden illness had sent the 41-year-old to the emergency room.
It was just more than a stomach flu. It was gastric pains, and I can't even imagine.
And even after his death, the exact nature of Frank's illness remained a mystery.
Nobody knew how he died, just that he was dead.
Angelina had her suspicions, though.
She believed he was poisoned, and she had a big, long story about who she thought had done it, someone that he had worked with.
She was apparently so certain that the former co-worker was behind Frank's death that she wanted to know why the investigators weren't pursuing it harder.
She calls police almost on a daily basis. She wants to know what the latest is, if there's been any updates.
And the investigators weren't the only ones Angelina had been harassing in the days following Frank's death.
She was bothering the heck out of the coroner's office,
wondering why we didn't have a death certificate.
Why was Angelina so anxious about Frank's death certificate? The investigators suspected it might have something to do with the $250,000 she was due to collect from Frank's life insurance.
She's impatient and she wants to get the benefits.
In fact, she had all but said as much in her interview with the investigators.
They probably won't pay because it's so new until the coroner says what the cause of death is.
But if the insurance money provided a motive for murder, there was still the matter of how.
She was claiming that one of his coworkers had put poison into his Gatorade.
Was it possible the autopsy had missed the poison? Frank's sister Shirley was convinced based on something Angelina had said. According to Shirley, it had first come up in a phone call while they were discussing plans for Frank's funeral.
She's telling me this, someone's poisoned your brother's story. And I said to her, Angelina, I just don't understand this. You know, how does someone poison a person?
And instead of saying, I don't know, Angelina says, oh, you can do it a number of ways.
Although according to Frank's sister, Angelina had mentioned one poison in particular.
Her answer to me was, oh, it's pretty easy. Like out here, we have oleander.
Oleander is a flower that's very prominent all over California, and it has properties that can be poisonous to humans.
Frank's sister said that Angelina had mentioned oleander again during the limo ride to Frank's funeral.
As we're driving along the highway, pointed out the oleander flower. He says, here, Shirley, you know, when we talked about oleander, those are the plants. They grow all over California. It's very easy. Anyone could get these.
At the beginning of October, the LA County Medical Examiner's Office sent tissue samples from Frank's autopsy off to a private lab to test for oleander. And while they waited for the results, the investigators did a little snooping of their own. And on October 9th, they made an interesting discovery in Angelina's backyard.
Angelina had an oleander plant growing over the fence.
However, just as the investigators were beginning to suspect Frank had been poisoned with oleander, Angelina called them up on October 19th and sent the investigation spinning in an entirely new direction.
Angelina told investigators she had just received an anonymous call.
And according to Angelina, the anonymous caller had offered her a tip.
This anonymous caller told her to tell them to look for antifreeze.
Was it possible the investigators were looking for the wrong poison? After all, ethylene glycol, the primary ingredient in antifreeze, is an even more deadly poison than oleander.
that tastes sweet and it's undetectable when you drink it in other drinks.
Or was it possible that Angelina was trying to throw the investigators off track?
This is the first time that antifreeze has been mentioned to police, and it comes directly from Angelina.
While not entirely sure what to make of Angelina's tip, the investigators did pass it along to the lab that was already testing for oleander. And on November 28th, the results came back.
And guess what? Both came back positive.
According to the tests, Frank had been poisoned with both oleander and antifreeze, although it appeared that what finally killed him was a massive dose of antifreeze.
Frank's body actually had 6 times the necessary amount to kill him.
The testing also revealed that he'd been given the fatal dose not long before his death. In other words, while he was at home under Angelina's care.
She was having him drink Gatorade, and she put the antifreeze in the Gatorade.
Investigators were convinced that Angelina had killed her husband, but they didn't arrest her just yet.
What they decide to do is get in touch with the coworker that Angelina had initially pinpointed as a suspect. They get this coworker to call Angelina.
And the investigators were listening in when he placed a call to Angelina on December 13th and asked why she was telling the police he had poisoned Frank.
He said, "Why are you saying these things about me? Please stop. You know how I had nothing to do with it."
The investigators hoped that Angelina might be so caught by surprise that she'd say something incriminating, but she refused to take the bait.
She didn't have a dialogue with him. She just told him that he needs to call the investigators.
It was a disappointing turn of events for the investigators. Or at least it would have been if Angelina hadn't called them moments later.
She called up and gave a different rendition of what the conversation was.
Angelina calls police and says, "Oh my gosh, Frank's old coworker just called me and now he's threatening me." Angelina doesn't know is that the joke's on her. Of course, the police knew that the coworker had called her.
And since they had both calls on tape, by the time Angelina hung up the phone, she had inadvertently allowed the investigators to catch her in a lie.
Angelina was really her own worst enemy.
At the end of January 2001, the investigators told Angelina that the medical examiner was finally going to issue a death certificate.
Angelina is just elated with these developments.
And then they told her that they were preparing an arrest warrant in the case.
She goes as far as asking police if she can be present when they arrest the coworker because she wants to see the look on his face.
And Angelina would be present for the arrest. On February 7th, 2001, almost 5 months after Frank's death, the LA County authorities knocked on Angelina's door with a warrant for her arrest.
Maybe we were finally going to get some justice from this. Maybe we were finally going to have some answers as to why this happened.
Going through Angelina's purse after taking her into custody, the investigators stumbled across one last piece of evidence that was almost too incredible to be believed. A carefully written out list of numbers.
It contained all the amounts of insurance money she stood to gain.
Not only that, it explains exactly what she's going to spend the money on.
She even calculated the interest she would earn from the insurance payout.
On October 15, 2003, 35-year-old Angelina Rodriguez went on trial in Los Angeles, California. She was accused of murdering her husband of 5 months, 41-year-old Frank Rodriguez. And if convicted, Angelina's life was on the line.
Angelina was charged with capital murder, and the death penalty was on the table.
And when the prosecutors opened their case against Angelina, they appeared determined to get it.
The prosecution in this case portrayed the defendant as calculating, manipulative, premeditated, committing an unspeakable act for greed.
And according to the prosecutors, it had been exceptionally cruel. First, she'd tried to kill him with oleander. And when that didn't work and the doctor sent Frank home, she'd finished him off with antifreeze under the guise of nursing him back to health.
She gave him tea, drinks, soups, and we don't know which of these items she put antifreeze in. He did not go quickly.
It was painful for him. It was a painful death.
And all those hours that Frank lingered in misery, Angelina watched him die.
It has a sadistic element to it.
They painted her as this woman who didn't see Frank as a husband, but just saw him as a payday. And they had a long line of proof.
For starters, they had testimony from Frank's sister about Angelina and her strange premonition that Frank had been poisoned with oleander.
I do remember the prosecutor having me go over what I had said in the limousine and the phone conversations that I'd had with Angelina.
She's pointing out to the sisters who came in from out of state. That's oleander, you know, it grows on the freeway here. Statements like that, the DA, I'm sure, felt were gems.
Then there was the telephone call with the man Angelina had accused of murder, Frank's former co-worker, and the call she had made to the cops soon after, claiming that he had threatened her.
Whatever Angelina's claims are, they know she's lying. They have it all on tape.
But most of all, they had plenty of evidence about how Angelina had not only pushed the medical examiner's office to issue a death certificate, she'd been pestering the insurance company too, anxious to collect on Frank's $250,000 insurance policy.
Within only a few hours of Frank's death, Angelina calls the insurance agent and asks him how quickly she could get her payout.
She's doing things that are so incredibly stupid and self-destructive that she's practically waving a flag at everybody saying, it's me, I'm the one.
The jury didn't have to take the prosecution's word for it either. They put Angelina and Frank's insurance agent on the stand to explain how the couple had taken out the $250,000 policy just 2 months before Frank's death. According to the agent, Frank had initially hesitated at buying the policy.
He said that he didn't feel that he needed any additional life insurance because he had insurance through his job.
But the agent said that Angelina wouldn't take no for an answer.
And she started to tell him all the reasons why that she felt that they needed insurance. And she was doing such a good job that I just sat there and shut my mouth and I said, hey, I'm going to let her do the selling for me.
Frank had agreed to take out the policy according to the agent. And barely 2 months later, Angelina had come looking to collect.
She called me and she said, I have some bad news. My husband's dead. And I said, wow.
The insurance agent wasn't the only new witness the prosecution put on the stand, though. They also called a woman named Palmyra, a friend of Angelina's from Paso Robles. Palmyra testified about discussions with Angelina that mirrored the ones that she'd had with Frank's sister.
She had had discussions with her friend about oleander.
However, unlike Frank's sister, Palmyra said that Angelina had started discussing oleander with her before Frank's death. That wasn't all, though, because Palmyra also revealed the real reason Angelina made all those weekend trips up to Paso Robles. She was having an affair.
Angelina had maintained a relationship with a boyfriend who lived up there.
Not only was Angelina having an affair, according to Palmyra, she had told her lover that she'd soon be free to spend even more time with him.
She told him on one of these weekends that when she returned home, she expected Frank to be dead.
Palmyra said that at the time, she thought Angelina had been joking about poisoning her husband. But once her friend had been arrested, she'd gone to the authorities and agreed to testify against her, and that Angelina eventually found out she was cooperating.
Angelina's just desperate. She calls and asks her to lie to investigators about a conversation they had had.
And like so many of Angelina's other phone conversations, the prosecutors had the whole thing on tape. However, Angelina's friend Palmyra wasn't the last person who turned against her. Next, the prosecutors told the jury how in May of 2002, Angelina's cellmate had come forward, claiming that she had been asking around the cell block, wondering if anyone could put her in touch with a hitman. The target, of course, was Palmyra. The friend Angelina had already tried to talk out of cooperating with the police.
She told her cellmate she would pay $20,000 to whomever would carry out the hit.
The cellmate told Angelina she might know someone, but that was a lie.
The very person that Angelina asked to do a hit turned around and told authorities what Angelina was doing.
Informed of what Angelina was up to, the authorities decided to play along. First, they had the cellmate tell Angelina it was all arranged. And then they sent an undercover cop to visit Angelina in jail, posing as the hitman with pictures of her friend Palmyra's body.
Something happened to your friend.
Oh, what?
Right.
Hey, where did you get those from?
What Angelina didn't know was that the photos were fake and that Palmyra had posed for them.
To act as though she's been shot. That way they can take these photographs, show them to Angelina.
And Angelina's response gave authorities exactly what they were looking for.
When the hitman presents Angelina with evidence that her best friend has been killed, she doesn't cry. She doesn't show any emotion.
The attempted hit, the affair, the insurance. By the time the prosecution rested its case, they'd piled up an impressive amount of evidence against Angelina.
The state had a very strong argument.
And yet, over at the defense table, Angelina appeared unfazed.
She just kind of sat there stone cold, just kind of an arrogant air about her.
On the other hand, her attorney was feeling anything but arrogant.
I was in a tough spot.
So tough that when it was the defense's turn to present its case, Angelina's attorney didn't put her on the stand or call any other witnesses.
There was so much evidence stacked against Angelina that there was not much they could do to prove or say otherwise.
And after one day of deliberation, the jury found Angelina guilty of first-degree murder.
Maybe we were finally going to get some justice.
On October 31st, 2003, just days after being convicted of murdering her husband, Frank, Angelina Rodriguez was back in a California courtroom. The jury that had decided she was guilty of first-degree murder still had to decide whether or not to sentence the 35-year-old to death.
She was just so cold-hearted about it all. It really turned them against her.
So during her sentencing hearing, the defense did its best to create sympathy for Angelina.
The strongest defense that Angelina had was her rough childhood.
She had come from a very traumatic past.
In fact, according to the defense, Angelina had been hiding a horrible secret her entire life. The grandfather who'd practically raised her had also abused her.
He began sexually molesting her when she was a very small child. And this continued until she was in her teens.
The defense even claimed that he had gotten Angelina pregnant twice.
She had, as a result of that illicit relationship, been forced to have 2 abortions. She tried killing herself several times as an escape from all this misery.
It was a sad story, one that might have earned the jury's sympathy if it weren't for the prosecutor's accusation about the other horrible trauma in Angelina's past, the death of her infant daughter.
She had been suspected of killing her own child.
Because just like in Frank's case, Angelina had received a huge payout from her daughter's death, larger even.
A total settlement of $750,000.
The defense denied the accusation, reminding the jury that Angelina had never been charged in her daughter's death.
She just thought that was ridiculous.
But prosecutors argued that even the possibility that Angelina could have been involved put her in a different class of criminal.
Every so often, you come across these criminals that seem so monstrous. The rest of us have a really hard time understanding.
Though the jury had no trouble reaching a decision.
They decided that there was only one fate for Angelina. She should die.
When the decision was handed down, Angelina stood stone-faced.
She just never, ever showed any remorse. She had no conscience. She just really did not. Cold-hearted killer. The term truly applies to her.
July 11th, 1979. Milan was settling into another quiet summer evening. The traffic that had crowded the streets throughout the day was slowly fading. Apartment windows began to glow with warm yellow light, and families gathered around dinner tables without realizing that history was about to record another tragic chapter. Somewhere in the city, a man was driving home after another exhausting day of work. He was not a police officer chasing dangerous criminals. He was not a judge preparing to sentence members of organized crime. He was not a politician surrounded by bodyguards or a journalist exposing corruption from behind a newspaper's front page. He was simply a lawyer. His name was Giorgio Ambrosoli. At 45 years old, he had spent years examining financial records, tracing missing assets, and trying to understand how one of Italy's most powerful banking empires had collapsed. The work demanded patience more than courage. It required long hours surrounded by documents rather than dramatic confrontations. Yet those documents contained secrets that many powerful people wished would remain buried forever. As Ambrosoli parked his car outside his apartment building, nothing about the scene suggested extraordinary danger. There were no flashing lights, no police protection waiting nearby, and no visible sign that someone had been watching his every move. He stepped out of his vehicle and began walking toward the entrance, just as he had done countless evenings before. Then a man appeared. There was no heated exchange, no warning, no opportunity to escape. The attacker raised a gun and fired several shots at close range. Giorgio Ambrosoli collapsed only a few steps from the door to his own home. Neighbors witnessed the horrifying scene, but it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Italy had just lost a man whose only weapon had been honesty. The murder shocked those who knew him because Ambrosoli had never sought public attention. He was not famous in the traditional sense. Outside legal and financial circles, many Italians had never even heard his name before the night he died. Yet within days, newspapers across the country were asking the same unsettling question. Why would anyone murder a bankruptcy lawyer? The question seemed almost absurd. Lawyers involved in commercial law usually spent their careers inside offices, discussing contracts, reviewing balance sheets, and representing clients in civil disputes. Their work rarely placed them in mortal danger. Ambrosoli's assignment appeared equally ordinary when viewed from a distance. Several years earlier, the Bank of Italy had appointed him to oversee the liquidation of a failed financial institution known as Banca Privata Italiana. His responsibility sounded technical rather than dangerous. He was expected to identify the bank's remaining assets, determine why it had collapsed, and manage the legal process that followed. On paper, it was a professional assignment requiring expertise in bankruptcy law. In reality, it would become one of the most dangerous investigations in modern Italian financial history. As Ambrosoli examined the bank's records, he gradually discovered that the collapse could not be explained by ordinary business failure. The deeper he looked, the more inconsistencies emerged. Money had disappeared. Financial documents appear to have been manipulated. Complex networks of companies obscured the movement of enormous sums. Each answer seemed to uncover another question, and each question led closer to individuals whose wealth and influence extended far beyond a single bank. Among those individuals stood Michelle Sindona, a financier who had once been celebrated as a financial genius. To many observers, Sindona represented remarkable success in international banking. Behind that public image, however, investigators would eventually uncover allegations of accounting fraud, shell companies, currency speculation, money laundering connected to the Sicilian mafia, and relationships reaching into influential political and financial circles. Ambrosoli's assignment slowly transformed from a legal exercise into something much larger. He was no longer simply managing the aftermath of a bankruptcy. He was uncovering evidence that threatened an entire network built upon deception. The further he advanced, the more dangerous his position became. Threats began arriving. Anonymous letters warned him to stop. Telephone calls attempted to frighten him into abandoning his work. Offers of money promised an easier path if only he would compromise his principles. Political pressure encouraged him to reconsider his determination. Every form of persuasion seemed to carry the same message: leave this investigation alone. Yet Giorgio Ambrosoli continued. His refusal did not stem from recklessness. Those who knew him described a careful and methodical lawyer, not a man seeking confrontation. He understood that his responsibility was to the law and to the truth contained within the evidence. He examined. He believed that his assignment deserved to be completed honestly, regardless of whose interests might suffer as a consequence. That quiet determination would ultimately cost him his life. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of this story is not found in a courtroom or a police report, but inside a personal letter. Before his death, Ambrosoli wrote to his wife. In that letter, he acknowledged the possibility that fulfilling his duty might require a terrible personal sacrifice. Rather than expressing fear, he asked that if such a sacrifice became necessary, his family should one day be proud that he had simply done what was right. Those words would later become one of the defining symbols of integrity in modern Italy. They reveal a man who understood the risks surrounding him, yet chose not to surrender to intimidation. The events of July 11th were therefore not random violence. They were the final act of a conflict that had unfolded quietly over several years. Unlike many criminal investigations involving dramatic robberies or sudden acts of passion, this story was built upon paperwork, financial transactions, legal documents, and patient persistence. Every ledger examined, every transfer reconstructed, and every fraudulent record uncovered slowly tightened the pressure around individuals who had once appeared untouchable. Eventually, someone decided that eliminating the investigator would be easier than answering his questions. Yet murder rarely erases the truth. Sometimes it does precisely the opposite. The death of Giorgio Ambrosoli transformed a relatively unknown lawyer into a national symbol. His assassination forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between financial institutions, organized crime, political influence, and the individuals willing to defend the rule of law despite overwhelming pressure. It demonstrated that corruption was not confined to dark alleyways or secret criminal meetings. It could exist behind polished office doors, inside respected banks, and within complicated financial structures that appeared legitimate to the outside world. The tragedy also challenged a comforting assumption held by many people, that ordinary professionals remain safely removed from violent crime. Ambrosoli's experience proved otherwise. He carried no badge, commanded no armed officers, and possessed no political authority. His greatest strength was his willingness to examine evidence honestly and refuse compromise. Ironically, that made him one of the most dangerous men to those whose power depended upon secrecy. In the years that followed, investigators would gather recorded threats, testimony from witnesses, and evidence supplied through cooperation with American authorities. Those pieces would eventually point toward the man prosecutors identified as the mastermind behind the assassination. Court proceedings would follow. Convictions would be secured. Yet, even after legal judgments were delivered, many aspects of the broader system that surrounded the crime continued to provoke discussion throughout Italy. This is not merely the story of a murder. It is the story of what can happen when professional integrity collides with enormous financial interests. It is the story of a lawyer who never expected to become a national symbol. A father who left home one morning believing he was simply going to work. And a man whose commitment to the truth proved more powerful than the fear others hoped to impose upon him. Before we can understand why Giorgio Ambrosoli was killed on that summer evening in Milan, we must first understand who he was, why he accepted an assignment that appeared routine, and how one investigation into a failed bank gradually exposed a web of fraud, hidden money, organized crime, and influence that reached far beyond anything anyone initially imagined. To understand the murder, we must begin several years earlier, when an honest lawyer accepted what seemed like nothing more than another professional responsibility, unaware that it would ultimately place him directly in the path of forces determined to ensure that some financial secrets would never be revealed. Long before his name became associated with one of Italy's most significant true crime cases, Giorgio Ambrosoli lived a life that appeared remarkably ordinary. There was nothing in his public image that suggested he would one day stand at the center of an investigation exposing connections between finance, organized crime, and powerful institutions. He did not cultivate fame, nor did he seek positions that promised public recognition. Instead, he built his career through disciplined professional competence and an unwavering belief that the law was meaningful only when it was applied without compromise. Born on October 17, 1933, in Milan, Ambrosoli belonged to a generation that understood the value of rebuilding institutions through responsibility and honest work. As he pursued a legal career, he specialized in commercial law and bankruptcy proceedings, an area of practice that demanded patience rather than publicity. Unlike criminal attorneys whose courtroom arguments often attracted media attention, lawyers working in commercial litigation spent much of their professional lives surrounded by contracts, corporate records, financial statements, and legal documentation. Success depended less upon dramatic speeches than upon meticulous attention to detail. Every figure had to be verified. Every transaction had to be understood. Every legal obligation required careful interpretation. These were precisely the qualities that gradually earned Giorgio Ambrosoli a reputation for integrity. Colleagues regarded him as careful, methodical, and exceptionally conscientious. His decisions reflected legal principles rather than personal convenience. In many ways, he represented the ideal of a professional whose credibility rested entirely upon trust. Clients and institutions relied upon him because they believed he would follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of how complicated the facts might become. That reputation, admirable as it was, would eventually lead him toward an assignment unlike any he had previously accepted. During the early 1970s, Italy's financial sector was experiencing growing instability. Among the institutions attracting increasing concern was Banca Privata Italiana, a bank whose collapse raised serious questions that could not be answered through ordinary explanations of poor management or unfortunate economic circumstances. When financial institutions fail, legal procedures must determine what assets remain, what obligations can still be satisfied, and why the failure occurred in the first place. Such work requires an independent legal professional capable of examining enormous quantities of financial material without prejudice or outside influence. In 1974, the Bank of Italy selected Giorgio Ambrosoli to serve as the liquidator of Banca Privata Italiana. At first glance, the appointment appeared to be a recognition of his professional competence. His legal expertise made him an appropriate choice for overseeing a complex liquidation process. His official responsibilities were clearly defined. He was expected to identify whatever assets remained within the institution, reconstruct its financial condition, determine the causes behind its collapse, and carry out the legal obligations associated with bankruptcy proceedings. None of these duties suggested that he would soon find himself confronting individuals connected to some of the most influential financial networks of the era. Yet the assignment possessed an unusual characteristic from the very beginning. The more thoroughly Ambrosoli examined the bank's records, the less they resembled the documents typically encountered during ordinary insolvency cases. Instead of presenting a straightforward financial disaster, the records hinted at a far more complicated reality. Transactions failed to align logically. Financial movements appeared unusually difficult to trace. Important information seemed obscured beneath layers of documentation that demanded increasingly detailed examination. As weeks turned into months, and months eventually became years, the investigation expanded far beyond the practical work of liquidating a failed bank. Behind the collapse stood a figure whose reputation extended well beyond Italy itself. Michel Sindona had long been regarded by many as one of the country's most brilliant financial minds. Newspapers and business circles often portrayed him as an extraordinarily successful banker capable of managing complex international financial operations with remarkable skill. His influence reached into prestigious banking institutions and important financial circles. To the outside world, Sindona embodied modern financial success. Wealth, international connections, and apparent expertise surrounded his public image. Yet public reputation and reality would prove to be very different things. As Ambrosoli continued reviewing the records entrusted to him, evidence gradually suggested that Sindona's financial empire rested upon practices far removed from legitimate banking. According to the evidence uncovered during the investigation, accounting records had been manipulated. Complex systems of shell companies had been established to disguise the movement of money. Currency speculation played a significant role in financial operations. Even more alarming, investigators would identify evidence indicating that portions of the financial network had been used for money laundering connected to the Sicilian mafia. The deeper the investigation progressed, the more extensive the web appeared. Sindona's relationships were not confined to private business alone. The available evidence demonstrated connections extending into influential political and financial circles. His name also became associated with Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank, illustrating that the investigation touched institutions carrying enormous significance within Italian public life. None of these discoveries emerged overnight. Every conclusion required careful examination of documents and financial records accumulated over years of work. For Ambrosoli, the assignment demanded extraordinary persistence. Unlike criminal investigators searching for fingerprints or forensic evidence, he confronted an entirely different landscape. The clues existed within ledgers, bank transfers, accounting statements, legal contracts, and corporate structures intentionally designed to conceal their true purpose. Understanding what had happened required reconstructing thousands of individual financial decisions until a coherent picture slowly emerged. It was painstaking work, and progress often came one document at a time. As Ambrosoli's understanding deepened, so too did the significance of his role. He was no longer merely supervising the liquidation of an insolvent bank. His investigation increasingly threatened to expose the mechanisms through which enormous sums of money had disappeared and the individuals responsible for creating those mechanisms. Every verified document reduced the room for denial. Every financial connection strengthened the emerging picture. Every unanswered question brought investigators closer to individuals whose influence had previously appeared beyond challenge. Such circumstances inevitably created conflict. From the perspective of those whose activities faced scrutiny, Ambrosoli represented a growing danger. Not because he possessed political authority or law enforcement powers, but because he refused to ignore evidence. His professional responsibility required him to continue examining the facts regardless of where they led. For a man like Michel Sindona, whose public reputation depended upon maintaining the appearance of legitimacy, that persistence carried potentially devastating consequences. If the investigation reached its logical conclusion, years of carefully constructed financial deception could become impossible to conceal. It is important to remember that Ambrosoli did not begin this assignment with the intention of pursuing any personal campaign against Sindona. Nothing in the available evidence suggests a private feud or ideological conflict between the two men before the liquidation proceedings began. Their relationship emerged solely because professional duty required Ambrosoli to investigate the collapse of Banca Privata Italiana. The evidence determined the direction of the investigation, not personal ambition. That distinction would later become one of the defining features of the entire case. Ambrosoli was not attempting to become a public hero. He was simply doing the work assigned to him by the Bank of Italy. Yet precisely because he approached the investigation with such professionalism, his findings carried exceptional credibility. They could not easily be dismissed as politically motivated or personally biased. They rested upon documentation, financial analysis, and legal procedure. This made them extraordinarily difficult to challenge without confronting the evidence itself. As the years passed, the assignment increasingly consumed Ambrosoli's professional life. Reconstructing the financial collapse required sustained cooperation with authorities beyond Italy. As additional information emerged, the investigation's complexity reflected the international nature of the financial operations involved. What initially appeared to concern a single Italian bank gradually expanded into questions reaching across national borders and involving institutions far removed from the original bankruptcy proceedings. By now, the quiet lawyer from Milan had unknowingly entered one of the most dangerous financial investigations in modern Italian history. He remained the same careful professional who had accepted the appointment in 1974, but the environment surrounding his work had changed dramatically. Every discovery increased the pressure upon those whose activities faced exposure. Every completed analysis narrowed the opportunities for concealment. Every passing month brought the investigation closer to conclusions that could alter the lives of powerful individuals. The assignment that had begun as a technical legal responsibility was becoming something entirely different. Without seeking confrontation, Giorgio Ambrosoli had placed himself directly in the path of a financial empire whose foundations appeared increasingly unstable. What made his position especially remarkable was not extraordinary courage displayed through dramatic gestures, but the quiet consistency with which he continued performing his duties. Day after day, document after document, he remained committed to the principle that facts mattered. In an environment shaped by influence, wealth, and hidden relationships, such commitment gradually became one of the greatest threats imaginable to those who depended upon secrecy. Neither Ambrosoli nor the public yet knew how high the stakes would become. The years ahead would bring discoveries involving fraudulent accounting, hidden companies, missing money, and cooperation with investigators in the United States. They would also bring intimidation, threats, and ultimately violence. But before any of those events unfolded, there was simply a lawyer in Milan carrying out the responsibilities entrusted to him by the Bank of Italy, believing that careful legal work could reveal the truth behind the collapse of a financial institution. That belief, grounded in professional integrity rather than personal ambition, would become the foundation upon which the rest of this extraordinary and tragic story would unfold. By the time Giorgio Ambrosoli entered the 5th year of his assignment, what had begun as a routine liquidation had evolved into an investigation with consequences reaching far beyond the walls of Banca Privata Italiana. The countless files that filled his office no longer represented the ordinary aftermath of a failed financial institution. Together, they revealed the outline of an intricate system designed not merely to hide losses, but to conceal the true movement of money and the individuals who benefited from it. Day after day, Ambrosoli continued the same disciplined process that had defined his career. He examined financial records with extraordinary care, comparing transactions, identifying inconsistencies, and reconstructing events that others appeared determined to keep fragmented. Unlike dramatic criminal investigations often portrayed in films, there were no dramatic confessions or spectacular discoveries occurring overnight. The truth emerged slowly through persistence. Every document answered one question while raising another. Every financial trail seemed to branch into additional companies, additional accounts, and additional layers of complexity. Gradually, several facts became increasingly difficult to ignore. Large amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, had been transferred outside Italy. These movements could not be explained by legitimate business activity alone. The accounting records themselves showed signs of manipulation. Documents that should have reflected an accurate financial picture instead appeared distorted, suggesting deliberate efforts to disguise the bank's true condition. As Ambrosoli continued his work, he encountered evidence indicating the existence of numerous shell companies. These entities complicated every attempt to determine where money had originated and where it had ultimately gone. Rather than functioning as ordinary businesses, they appeared to serve as instruments through which financial transactions could be concealed from meaningful scrutiny. Each newly identified company required additional investigation, creating an increasingly complicated map of interconnected financial relationships. Even more troubling was another conclusion emerging from the evidence. According to the findings developed during the investigation, some of the money moving through these financial structures had links to the Sicilian Mafia. This transformed the case into something far more significant than corporate fraud alone. The investigation was no longer simply about accounting irregularities or the collapse of a private bank. It now suggested that organized crime had become intertwined with sophisticated financial operations, capable of moving enormous sums through apparently legitimate institutions. For Ambrosoli, these discoveries did not change the way he approached his work. His responsibility remained exactly what it had been from the beginning: determine the facts honestly and document them accurately. Yet the implications of those facts continued to grow. Every verified conclusion increased the potential consequences for individuals whose reputations and fortunes depended upon the secrecy of those financial arrangements. Among them, Michel Sindona remained at the center of attention. Once praised publicly as a brilliant financier, he now faced mounting evidence that threatened to dismantle the image carefully cultivated throughout his career. As the investigation progressed, it also crossed national borders. Ambrosoli began cooperating with the United States Department of Justice, providing evidence connected to the collapse of Franklin National Bank. The information developed through his examination of Banca Privata Italiana proved relevant beyond Italy. contributing to efforts by American authorities to understand the broader financial activities associated with Sindona. This cooperation demonstrated that the investigation was no longer confined to a single country or a single institution. Financial transactions had moved internationally, and so too did the effort to understand them. For Ambrosoli, this cooperation represented another professional obligation. He shared evidence because the facts required it. Yet each additional authority receiving information increased the pressure upon those whose conduct was being examined. The possibility that investigations in different countries might reinforce one another created a situation increasingly difficult for anyone involved to control. As the evidence accumulated, another pattern emerged alongside the financial discoveries. Pressure began surrounding the man conducting the investigation. At first, the warnings appeared indirectly. Anonymous letters arrived carrying unmistakable messages that his work should stop. Their authors concealed their identities, but their purpose remained obvious. They were intended to persuade him that continuing the investigation would carry consequences. Telephone calls followed. Some attempted intimidation through direct threats. Others sought to create fear by suggesting that powerful individuals were watching every step of the investigation. Unlike ordinary disagreements within the legal profession, these communications carried an unmistakable implication that danger extended beyond the courtroom or the office. There were also attempts to achieve the same objective through different means. Rather than threatening violence, some approached Ambrosoli with offers of money. The message behind these proposals was equally clear. If he abandoned his investigation or softened its conclusions, there would be rewards instead of consequences. His integrity, however, proved impossible to purchase. Throughout his career, Ambrosoli had built his reputation upon independence. Accepting such offers would have destroyed the very principles that defined both his profession and his identity. Alongside threats and bribery came political pressure. Voices encouraged him to reconsider his determination, implying that pursuing the investigation too aggressively could produce consequences extending far beyond legal proceedings. The details of that pressure varied, but the underlying objective remained constant. Powerful interests wanted the investigation to end before it reached its final conclusions. Faced with these combined efforts, anonymous warnings, threatening calls, financial inducements, and political influence, many individuals might have chosen the safer path. Giorgio Ambrosoli did not. His refusal was not dramatic. There were no public speeches announcing his courage, nor did he seek media attention by describing the pressure he faced. Instead, he continued doing precisely what he had always done. Each morning he returned to his work, reviewed additional documents, organized evidence, and advanced the investigation one careful step at a time. Perhaps the clearest reflection of his state of mind appeared not in public statements, but in a deeply personal letter written to his wife. In that letter, Ambrosoli acknowledged something that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. He understood that completing his professional duty might ultimately require a terrible personal sacrifice. Yet instead of expressing bitterness or regret, he wrote that if such a sacrifice became necessary, his family should one day be proud that he had fulfilled his responsibility honestly. The letter revealed neither recklessness nor resignation. Rather, it reflected a profound acceptance that integrity sometimes carries costs beyond anything a professional expects when accepting an assignment. Those words would later become one of the enduring symbols associated with his legacy, reminding future generations that moral courage is often expressed quietly rather than dramatically. While Ambrosoli remained committed to his work, developments elsewhere were moving toward a far more violent conclusion. According to investigators, Michel Sindona increasingly recognized the danger posed by the investigation. After years of painstaking analysis, Ambrosoli was approaching the completion of findings capable of contributing not only to financial accountability, but also to criminal consequences. The evidence assembled over nearly 5 years threatened to expose the structures upon which Sendona's financial empire depended. From the investigator's perspective, eliminating the investigation itself had become impossible. Too much evidence already existed. Too many authorities had become involved. Instead, attention turned toward eliminating the man responsible for bringing that evidence together. Investigators would later conclude that Sindona decided to have Giorgio Ambrosoli murdered. To carry out that decision, he turned to William Joseph Arrico, an Italian-American criminal associated with organized crime. Arrico's role differed entirely from the lawyers, accountants, and financial specialists whose work had shaped the investigation. Where Ambrosoli relied upon documentation and legal procedure, Arrico represented violence as a means of solving problems. Before the murder, Arrico contacted Ambrosoli by telephone. During one of these threatening conversations, he invoked the name of Giulio Andreotti in what investigators later described as an effort to increase psychological pressure upon the lawyer. Rather than reacting emotionally, Ambrosoli did something entirely consistent with the careful habits that had defined his investigation from the beginning. He recorded the conversation. Once again, evidence became his response. Instead of allowing intimidation to remain invisible, he preserved it. That recording would later become one of the important pieces of evidence examined during the investigation following his death. The weeks passed. Summer arrived in Milan. Outwardly, life continued as normal. Ambrosoli maintained his professional responsibilities while balancing the ordinary routines of family life. Few people passing him on the street would have recognized that he stood at the center of one of Italy's most consequential financial investigations. Fewer still could have imagined that someone had already decided he would not be allowed to complete it. Then came the evening of July 11th, 1979. After another day devoted to his work, Giorgio Ambrosoli drove home to his apartment in Milan. Earlier that same day, he had communicated with American investigators regarding the Sindona case, continuing the international cooperation that had become an important part of the investigation. Nothing suggested that this routine would be different from countless others. He parked his car outside his residence and stepped onto the street. As he approached the entrance, William Arrico was waiting. There was no prolonged confrontation, no public argument, no attempt to negotiate. According to the established account of the crime, Arrico simply approached and fired several shots at close range. The attack was swift and deliberate. Giorgio Ambrosoli collapsed outside the entrance to his own home. Neighbors witnessed the horrifying scene, but there was no opportunity to intervene before the gunman completed his task. The lawyer who had spent nearly 5 years following financial evidence with unwavering discipline died only a short distance from the safety of his front door. He was 45 years old. Behind him remained his wife and their 3 young children. His investigation, however, did not die with him. The documents he had assembled, the evidence he had preserved, the financial trails he had reconstructed, and even the threatening telephone conversation he had recorded all remained. The individuals responsible for ordering and carrying out the assassination had succeeded in silencing one man, but they had not erased the facts he had uncovered. Instead, the murder transformed those facts into the focus of an even larger investigation. What had begun as the collapse of a private bank had now become the assassination of a lawyer whose only offense was refusing to abandon the search for the truth. In attempting to stop the investigation forever, those behind the killing had instead ensured that the entire nation would begin asking questions that could no longer be ignored. The murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli did not create uncertainty about whether his death was connected to his professional work. Almost immediately, investigators recognized that they were not dealing with a random act of violence. a robbery gone wrong, or a personal dispute. Everything surrounding the crime pointed toward a targeted assassination. The victim had spent nearly 5 years conducting one of the most sensitive financial investigations. In Italy, during that time, he had repeatedly received threats, rejected attempts to influence his work, and continued uncovering evidence that placed increasing pressure on powerful individuals. His death occurred just as that investigation was approaching its conclusion. For the authorities, these facts established the first and most important question: who had the strongest motive to silence Giorgio Ambrosoli? Unlike many homicide investigations that begin with countless possible suspects, this case immediately presented investigators with an obvious direction. Throughout the years leading to the murder, Ambrosoli had acquired what many considered to be only one clearly identifiable enemy: Michele Sindona. The conflict between the two men had never been personal. They had not become rivals through business competition or private disagreement. Their relationship existed solely because Ambrosoli had accepted responsibility for liquidating Banca Privata Italiana and had faithfully followed the financial evidence wherever it led. Every significant discovery made during those years threatened Sindona's financial interests and public reputation. The motive, therefore, appeared direct and understandable. If Ambrosoli completed his work, the consequences for Sindona could be devastating. The investigation following the murder did not begin from speculation alone. It also relied upon evidence that Ambrosoli himself had carefully preserved before his death. Throughout his career, he had responded to pressure not with emotional reactions, but with documentation. This habit would prove invaluable even after he was no longer alive to explain what had happened. One of the strongest pieces of evidence came from the threatening telephone conversations he had received before the assassination. Rather than dismissing these calls or relying upon memory alone, Ambrosoli had recorded at least one significant conversation involving William Joseph Arrico. During that call, Arrico attempted to intimidate the lawyer, even invoking the name of Giulio Andreotti in what investigators later understood to be an effort to increase psychological pressure. The recording transformed what might otherwise have become an unverified allegation into tangible evidence. Investigators no longer needed to rely solely upon recollections. They possessed the actual conversation preserved by the victim himself. The importance of that recording cannot be overstated. Threats often disappear as soon as they are spoken. They leave little physical evidence and frequently become matters of one person's word against another's. Ambrosoli's decision to record the conversation reflected the same careful judgment that had characterized every stage of his financial investigation. Instead of allowing intimidation to remain hidden, he documented it. That decision ensured that the threats would continue speaking long after he no longer could. The recorded conversation became one component within a broader body of evidence demonstrating that Ambrosoli had been subjected to sustained pressure during the years preceding his death. Investigators also examined testimony from individuals who knew about the environment surrounding the liquidation of Banca Privata Italiana. Witnesses described the various forms of pressure that Ambrosoli had experienced while carrying out his assignment. These accounts supported what had already become apparent through other evidence. The lawyer had not simply been conducting routine bankruptcy proceedings. He had been working under extraordinary conditions in which intimidation had become a recurring reality. Anonymous letters, threatening telephone calls, bribery attempts, and political pressure formed a consistent pattern rather than isolated incidents. Each event alone might have appeared insignificant. Taken together, however, they revealed a sustained effort to influence or halt the investigation before it reached its conclusions. Investigators therefore viewed the murder not as an isolated act, but as the final stage of an escalating campaign against Ambrosoli. Another important dimension of the investigation involved cooperation beyond Italy. Even before the murder, Ambrosoli had been working with the United States Department of Justice, providing evidence connected to the financial activities surrounding Michelle Sindona and the collapse of Franklin National Bank. Following the assassination, this international cooperation assumed even greater importance. American authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, possessed information relevant to Sindona's financial dealings. Their evidence complemented the work already completed in Italy, allowing investigators to examine the broader picture rather than treating the murder as an entirely separate event. The exchange of information between Italian and American authorities strengthened the overall investigation by demonstrating that the financial issues uncovered by Ambrosoli extended across national borders. This was not simply a domestic banking dispute. The financial structures under examination involved international transactions and institutions, whose activities reached well beyond Italy. As investigators assembled the available evidence, an increasingly coherent picture emerged. They examined Ambrosoli's professional findings, the pattern of threats directed toward him, the recorded telephone conversation involving William Arrico, testimony describing the pressure he had endured, and information provided through cooperation with American authorities. Rather than pointing in multiple conflicting directions, these independent sources consistently reinforced one another. Each additional element strengthened the conclusion that the murder had been committed to stop Ambrosoli's investigation before it could produce its full legal consequences. Step by step, investigators reconstructed the sequence leading to the assassination. They began with the assignment accepted in 1974. They followed Ambrosoli's discovery of accounting fraud, shell companies, missing funds, and evidence of money laundering linked to the Sicilian mafia. They documented the increasing pressure placed upon him as his investigation advanced. They incorporated the threatening communications, including the recorded telephone call. Finally, they examined the circumstances of the shooting itself. Viewed together, these events formed a logical progression rather than unrelated incidents. The investigation suggested that as the evidence against Sindona grew stronger, so too did the efforts to stop the lawyer responsible for uncovering it. Eventually, investigators reached the conclusion that Michelle Sindona had ordered the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli. William Joseph Arrico, according to the evidence, carried out the killing, but investigators identified Sindona as the individual who had made the decision to eliminate the lawyer. This conclusion rested not upon a single dramatic discovery, but upon the cumulative strength of multiple independent pieces of evidence that pointed toward the same explanation. In many true crime cases, investigators face significant uncertainty because physical evidence is limited. Motives remain unclear, or suspects possess convincing alternative explanations. The Ambrosoli investigation differed in an important respect. The central issue was not identifying whether the murder had been connected to his work. Nearly every significant fact supported that conclusion. Instead, the investigation focused upon demonstrating who had ordered the assassination and establishing the evidence necessary to prove responsibility within a court of law. That distinction shaped every subsequent stage of the legal process. Beyond the criminal investigation itself, the assassination produced a profound impact upon Italian public opinion. The murder forced many citizens to reconsider assumptions about financial crime. Until then, complex banking scandals often appeared distant from ordinary life, discussed primarily in legal proceedings or business publications. Ambrosoli's death changed that perception dramatically. A lawyer had been murdered not because of personal revenge or organized criminal rivalry in the traditional sense, but because he had investigated financial records honestly. The implication was deeply unsettling. It suggested that sophisticated financial crime could generate violence every bit as deadly as conventional organized criminal activity. The case also illuminated the extraordinary risks faced by individuals who challenge powerful financial interests through lawful means. Ambrosoli possessed no armed protection. He relied entirely upon legal procedure and documented evidence. Yet those very qualities made him dangerous to individuals whose influence depended upon secrecy. His assassination demonstrated that corruption did not always respond to legal accountability. Through courtroom arguments, sometimes it responded through intimidation, and when intimidation failed, through murder. Another important realization emerged as investigators continued their work. The case revealed how financial crime, organized crime, and influential networks could become interconnected. The evidence uncovered during the liquidation of Banca Privata Italiana had already indicated relationships involving fraudulent accounting, shell companies, international financial transactions, money laundering connected to the Sicilian mafia, and influential financial circles. The murder itself reinforced the seriousness of those connections. Violence was not separate from the financial misconduct under investigation. According to the investigators' conclusions, it became a method chosen to protect that misconduct from exposure. Ironically, the decision to murder Giorgio Ambrosoli achieved the opposite of what those responsible intended. Rather than ending scrutiny, the assassination intensified it. The investigation into the lawyer's death drew even greater public attention to the financial evidence he had uncovered during his lifetime. Journalists, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens increasingly recognized that the issues Ambrosoli had been examining could no longer be dismissed as technical disputes within the banking sector. They represented questions touching the integrity of financial institutions, the influence of organized crime, and the capacity of the legal system to hold powerful individuals accountable. In death, Ambrosoli's meticulous habits continued to serve justice. The documents he had assembled remained intact. The financial analysis he had completed retained its evidentiary value. The recorded threats continued speaking for him. Witnesses confirmed the pressure he had endured. International cooperation provided additional support. Every careful decision he had made while alive strengthened the investigation after his murder. His professionalism became part of the evidence itself. By the time investigators completed their work, the path from financial investigation to assassination had become tragically clear. An honest lawyer accepted responsibility for liquidating a failed bank. His investigation uncovered evidence of extensive financial wrongdoing. As those discoveries accumulated, pressure mounted in an attempt to stop him. When intimidation, bribery, and political influence failed, violence followed. Investigators ultimately concluded that the murder had not been an unpredictable act of criminal aggression, but the calculated elimination of a man whose commitment to legal duty threatened powerful interests. The investigation into Giorgio Ambrosoli's death, therefore, accomplished more than identifying those responsible for a single homicide. It exposed the lengths to which influential individuals were prepared to go in order to protect hidden financial structures from public scrutiny. It also ensured that the work Ambrosoli had devoted nearly 5 years to completing would not disappear with him. Instead, his investigation became the foundation upon which prosecutors would soon build one of the most significant criminal cases arising from the intersection of finance, organized crime, and the rule of law in modern Italian history. The murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli marked the end of one man's life, but it did not bring an end to the search for accountability. Instead, it shifted the focus from the painstaking financial investigation he had spent nearly 5 years conducting to a legal battle aimed at determining who had ordered his assassination. The evidence Ambrosoli had gathered during his lifetime did not disappear with him. On the contrary, it became one of the foundations upon which prosecutors continued building their case. The investigation into the collapse of Banca Privata Italiana and the investigation into Ambrosoli's murder were now inseparably linked. The same financial discoveries that had placed the lawyer in danger also helped explain why he had become a target. Prosecutors approached the case by examining the entire sequence of events rather than treating the assassination as an isolated crime. They considered the appointment of Ambrosoli by the Bank of Italy in 1974, the years of detailed financial analysis that followed, the evidence he uncovered involving fraudulent accounting, shell companies, missing funds, and money connected to the Sicilian Mafia, his cooperation with the United States Department of Justice during the Franklin National Bank investigation, the repeated threats directed against him, the attempted bribery, the political pressure, and finally the carefully executed shooting outside his Milan home on July 11, 1979. Viewed individually, each event described only one chapter of the story. Viewed together, they revealed a consistent progression that prosecutors argued could not reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. The central issue before the court was not whether Giorgio Ambrosoli had been murdered, nor was there serious doubt that his death was connected to his professional work. Instead, the court had to determine who had ordered the assassination. According to the conclusions reached during the investigation, the answer pointed to Michele Sindona, once celebrated as one of Italy's most influential financiers. Sindona now stood accused not only of the financial misconduct that had brought Banca Privata Italiana to collapse, but also of arranging the murder of a lawyer whose investigation threatened to expose that misconduct completely. The prosecution's case rested upon a body of evidence accumulated over many years rather than upon a single dramatic revelation. One important element remained the threatening communications Ambrosoli had received before his death. His careful decision to record at least one conversation involving William Joseph Arrico became particularly significant because it demonstrated that intimidation had not been imagined or exaggerated after the fact. The recording provided direct evidence that pressure had been applied to the lawyer while he was still alive. It also illustrated the increasingly hostile environment surrounding his investigation as he moved closer to completing his work. Additional evidence came from witnesses who had first-hand knowledge of the pressure placed upon Ambrosoli throughout the liquidation proceedings. Their testimony confirmed that threats, anonymous letters, bribery attempts, and political influence had formed part of the reality in which the lawyer carried out his responsibilities. These accounts supported the prosecution's argument that the murder represented the culmination of an escalating effort to prevent the investigation from reaching its conclusion. The international dimension of the case also remained important during the legal process. Ambrosoli's cooperation with American authorities had already demonstrated that the financial activities under examination extended beyond Italy. Information provided through the United States Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation contributed to the broader understanding of Michele Sindona's financial operations. This international cooperation reinforced the prosecution's position by showing that Ambrosoli's investigation had significance well beyond a single bankruptcy proceeding. It also emphasized the extent to which the financial network under scrutiny crossed national borders, involving transactions and institutions that could not be understood within Italy alone. As the legal proceedings continued, prosecutors argued that the motive behind the assassination had become unmistakably clear. Giorgio Ambrosoli had not been chosen as a victim because of a personal dispute. He had not become involved in criminal organizations or political conflicts of his own choosing. He had simply accepted an official assignment and refused to abandon it despite mounting pressure. The investigation he conducted threatened to expose financial misconduct with potentially devastating consequences for Michelle Sindona. According to the prosecution, eliminating Ambrosoli became the method chosen to prevent those consequences. Throughout the proceedings, the image of Giorgio Ambrosoli himself remained central to the case. His reputation for honesty had been firmly established long before his appointment as liquidator. Nothing in his professional history suggested personal ambition or political motivation. Instead, the evidence consistently portrayed a lawyer committed to fulfilling his legal responsibilities with independence and integrity. This credibility strengthened the prosecution's argument because it became increasingly difficult to portray his investigation as biased or improperly motivated. The work he completed reflected the same careful professionalism that had defined his career from the beginning. Years after the murder, the court ultimately reached its decision. In 1986, Michelle Sindona was convicted as the mastermind behind the assassination of Giorgio Ambrosoli and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict represented the legal conclusion of one of Italy's most significant criminal cases involving the intersection of financial crime, organized crime, and political influence. The sentence also carried symbolic importance. It affirmed that ordering the murder of a lawyer performing his official duties would not remain beyond the reach of the justice system, regardless of the influence or financial power possessed by the individual responsible. Yet the legal story did not end entirely with that verdict. William Joseph Arrico, identified as the man who carried out the shooting outside Ambrosoli's home, never appeared before an Italian court. He had died in the United States in 1984 during an attempted prison escape, 2 years before Sindona received his life sentence. As a result, the individual accused of pulling the trigger was never tried in Italy for his role in the assassination. His death closed one chapter of the case before it could reach the courtroom. Nevertheless, investigators had already concluded that Arrico had acted as the hired killer rather than as the person responsible for planning the crime. The prosecution therefore concentrated upon establishing responsibility at the level of the individual who had ordered the assassination. The conclusion reached by the court reflected that distinction. Michelle Sindona's conviction recognized him as the mastermind behind the murder, even though the gunman himself was no longer alive to face Italian justice. Remarkably, another unexpected development followed only days after the verdict. Michelle Sindona died in prison from cyanide poisoning shortly after receiving his life sentence. His death immediately attracted widespread attention because of both its timing and its unusual circumstances. Even today, the circumstances surrounding his death continue to generate discussion and controversy. However, despite ongoing debate, the essential legal conclusion established by the court remained unchanged. Sindona had been convicted as the individual responsible for ordering Giorgio Ambrosoli's murder, before his own death brought further proceedings to an end. For the Ambrosoli family, the verdict could never restore what had been taken from them on the evening of July 11, 1979. A husband and father had been murdered outside his own home after years of faithfully carrying out the responsibilities entrusted to him. No sentence, regardless of its severity, could reverse that loss. Yet the court's decision represented an acknowledgement that the crime had not been meaningless or forgotten. It confirmed that the justice system had recognized both the motive behind the assassination and the responsibility of the man who had ordered it. The proceedings also carried significance extending far beyond one family. They demonstrated that financial crimes concealed behind complex banking structures could ultimately be examined within a courtroom and linked to acts of extreme violence when supported by careful investigation and documented evidence. Throughout the case, the professionalism of Giorgio Ambrosoli continued to shape the outcome even though he was no longer alive to testify. his records, his findings, his documented work, and even the threatening telephone conversation he had preserved all became part of the evidentiary foundation supporting the prosecution. In an important sense, the meticulous habits that had defined his career continued speaking on his behalf during the trial. Every document he had organized, every financial inconsistency he had identified, and every careful decision to preserve evidence strengthened the pursuit of justice after his death. The verdict, therefore, represented more than the conviction of one influential financier. It also validated the years of disciplined work performed by the lawyer whose investigation had uncovered the truth at such extraordinary personal cost. The courtroom confirmed what Giorgio Ambrosoli had believed from the beginning, that facts matter, evidence matters, and professional integrity matters even when confronting individuals who appear untouchable. His murder had been intended to silence an investigation. Yet the evidence he left behind ultimately contributed to the legal accountability of the man prosecutors identified as its architect. In that sense, the attempt to destroy the investigation ultimately failed. The lawyer lost his life, but the truth he had uncovered continued into the courtroom, where it became an essential part of one of Italy's most consequential judicial decisions concerning corruption, financial crime, and the rule of law. When the courtroom proceedings came to an end, the legal questions surrounding the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli had largely been answered. Investigators had identified the man they believed ordered the assassination. A court had delivered its verdict. The hired gunman was already dead, and Michele Sindona himself died only days after receiving a life sentence. From a legal perspective, the case had reached its conclusion. But some crimes leave consequences that extend far beyond the final page of a court record. The assassination of Giorgio Ambrosoli became one of those cases. It continued to shape the way Italy understood corruption, financial crime, and the personal cost of defending the rule of law. Unlike many victims whose names gradually disappear from public memory as years pass, Ambrosoli's legacy continued to grow. During his lifetime, he had never sought recognition. He had accepted an assignment because it was his professional responsibility, not because he hoped to become a symbol of justice. Yet history often remembers people not for the positions they held, but for the principles they refused to abandon when those principles became dangerous. Giorgio Ambrosoli had spent nearly 5 years doing exactly what the Bank of Italy had asked him to do. He examined financial records, reconstructed transactions, identified remaining assets, and sought to determine why Banca Privata Italiana had collapsed. At every stage, he relied upon documentation rather than assumption and evidence rather than speculation. When intimidation appeared, he did not answer with dramatic public statements. Instead, he continued working. When anonymous letters arrived, he continued working. When threatening telephone calls attempted to frighten him into silence, he continued working. When offers of bribery suggested that abandoning the investigation would bring personal benefit, he continued working. Even political pressure failed to alter his commitment to completing the task honestly. Looking back, what distinguishes Ambrosoli is not extraordinary heroism in the conventional sense. He did not carry out dangerous undercover operations or pursue armed criminals through city streets. His courage appeared in a quieter form. It was reflected in his willingness to remain faithful to ordinary professional responsibilities, even after those responsibilities became extraordinarily dangerous. That quiet persistence ultimately transformed him into one of Italy's enduring symbols of integrity. The significance of his assassination also reached beyond the tragedy experienced by his own family. Until the events surrounding his death, many people regarded financial crime as something abstract. Banking scandals appeared to belong to the world of accountants, lawyers, and economists. They were discussed through numbers, legal documents, and balance sheets rather than through acts of violence. The murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli shattered that perception. His death demonstrated that enormous financial interests could be defended with the same ruthless determination commonly associated with organized crime. The investigation had already uncovered evidence involving fraudulent accounting, shell companies, hidden transfers of hundreds of millions of dollars, and money connected to the Sicilian mafia. The assassination made one additional fact impossible to ignore. When those financial structures faced exposure, violence could become the chosen response. In that sense, Ambrosoli's murder became a turning point in Italy's broader understanding of corruption. It illustrated that financial misconduct did not exist separately from organized criminal activity. Instead, the two could become deeply interconnected through systems of money laundering, concealed financial transactions, and influential relationships extending across both business and political circles. The case revealed how carefully constructed financial empires could rely not only upon deception but also upon intimidation when deception alone was no longer sufficient. Another enduring lesson emerged from the role played by professional integrity. Throughout the investigation, Ambrosoli possessed no extraordinary authority beyond the legal responsibilities entrusted to him. He was not directing criminal prosecutions. He did not command police officers. He exercised influence through one simple principle: careful examination of evidence. Ironically, that principle made him extraordinarily dangerous to individuals who depended upon secrecy. His work demonstrated that truth often emerges not through dramatic moments, but through patience, discipline, and meticulous attention to detail. Every accounting record he examined, every financial transfer he reconstructed, and every document he preserved gradually reduced the space available for deception. His greatest strength was not power, but credibility. Because he consistently approached the investigation with honesty and professionalism, his conclusions became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The letter Ambrosoli wrote to his wife before his death acquired special meaning in the years that followed. Knowing that his work had placed him in danger, he acknowledged the possibility that fulfilling his duty might require the ultimate sacrifice. Yet instead of expressing resentment or asking that his work be abandoned, he wrote that if such a sacrifice became necessary, his family should one day be proud that he had simply done what was right. Those words survived long after the violence of July 11th, 1979 had passed into history. They became more than a private message between husband and wife. They evolved into a public reminder that integrity often demands perseverance without any guarantee of safety or recognition. Many people came to regard that letter as one of the clearest expressions of professional ethics in modern Italian history. It reflected a belief that public institutions depend not only upon laws, but also upon individuals willing to apply those laws honestly. Even when powerful interests attempt to interfere, Ambrosoli's life illustrated that legal systems are ultimately strengthened by ordinary professionals who refuse to compromise their responsibilities. Years after the assassination, his story reached new audiences through the 1995 film Un Ero Borghese, translated into English as An Ordinary Hero. The title itself captured the central truth of his legacy. Giorgio Ambrosoli had never presented himself as extraordinary. He did not imagine becoming a national symbol. He was an ordinary lawyer performing an ordinary legal assignment with extraordinary honesty. The film helped preserve his story for future generations, ensuring that his contribution to Italy's fight against corruption would not fade with time. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ambrosoli's legacy lies in the irony at the heart of the entire case. The decision to murder him had one clear objective: to stop an investigation. Those responsible believed that eliminating the investigator would protect the financial structures he had spent years uncovering. Instead, the opposite occurred. His assassination drew national and international attention to the very issues his investigation had revealed. The documents he had assembled became even more significant after his death. The threatening telephone conversation he had recorded became evidence. His cooperation with American authorities gained additional importance. The work that others hoped to silence became impossible to ignore. In death, Giorgio Ambrosoli's investigation reached a larger audience than it ever could have during his lifetime. His murder ensured that countless people who had never heard his name would eventually learn why he had been killed. It also strengthened public awareness that corruption hidden behind respectable institutions could have consequences measured not merely in financial losses, but in human lives. The case continues to remind legal professionals that some of the most dangerous investigations are not necessarily those involving visible violence from the beginning. Sometimes the greatest risks emerge from patient examinations of financial records capable of exposing hidden systems of power. Ambrosoli understood that his responsibility was simply to establish the facts. He could not control how others would react to those facts. He could only ensure that the truth was documented honestly. His approach remains a powerful example of the essential role played by independent legal professionals within democratic institutions. As we reach the end of this story, it is worth returning one final time to that quiet evening in Milan on July 11th, 1979. A 45-year-old lawyer finished another day of work, drove home, parked his car, and walked toward the entrance of his apartment building. Within moments, his life was over. On the surface, it appeared to be the end of a single investigation. In reality, it marked the beginning of something much larger. The murder forced an entire nation to confront uncomfortable truths about corruption, organized crime, financial influence, and the vulnerability of those who choose principle over compromise. Decades have passed since those gunshots echoed outside Giorgio Ambrosoli's home. Yet the questions raised by his life remain as relevant as ever. What responsibility does a professional bear when confronted with corruption? How should institutions protect those entrusted with defending the public interest? And perhaps most importantly, what happens to a society when honesty becomes dangerous? Giorgio Ambrosoli never claimed to possess all the answers. His contribution was simpler and, in many ways, more profound. He demonstrated that the search for truth begins with the willingness to examine evidence honestly and to follow it wherever it leads, regardless of the personal consequences. That decision cost him his life, but it also secured his place in history. Today, Giorgio Ambrosoli is remembered not because he sought greatness, but because he refused to surrender his integrity. In a case defined by immense financial power, organized crime, and hidden influence, the most enduring figure is not the banker who built an empire through deception, nor the gunman who carried out an assassination. It is the quiet lawyer who believed that the law should apply equally to everyone, who remained faithful to that belief until his final day, and whose legacy continues to remind future generations that justice is sustained not only by courts and governments, but by ordinary people who choose honesty even when dishonesty appears far safer. In the end, the greatest victory achieved by Giorgio Ambrosoli was not a courtroom verdict or a criminal conviction. It was proving that integrity can outlive intimidation, that truth can survive violence, and that one person's unwavering commitment to doing the right thing can continue inspiring others long after the final chapter of a case has been written. Every true crime story eventually reaches a point where the investigation is complete. The courtroom has spoken, and history begins deciding what the case will ultimately mean. For the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli, that process did not begin with newspaper headlines or courtroom applause. It began with silence, the silence left behind after the gunfire ended. The silence inside a family that had suddenly lost a husband and a father. The silence of an office where unfinished files still waited on a desk. And, perhaps most importantly, the silence created when an honest man could no longer explain the work that had consumed the final years of his life. Yet silence has a curious way of inviting questions. People who had never met Giorgio Ambrosoli began asking why an ordinary lawyer had become the target of an assassination. Why would someone investigating the collapse of a bank be considered dangerous enough to eliminate? Why had years of financial documents, accounting records, and legal proceedings ended with murder instead of a civil judgment? Those questions gradually transformed public understanding of the entire case. Before Ambrosoli's death, many viewed the collapse of Banca Privata Italiana primarily as a complicated financial affair, one best understood by bankers, lawyers, and accountants. After his assassination, it became impossible to separate financial crime from its human consequences. The numbers recorded on accounting ledgers no longer represented abstract economic losses. They represented motives powerful enough to destroy a family and silence a public servant. The case revealed that corruption is rarely confined to paperwork alone. Hidden behind every fraudulent balance sheet may stand individuals prepared to protect deception through intimidation, influence, or violence when necessary. Giorgio Ambrosoli himself never attempted to become the face of a national movement. Throughout every stage of the investigation, he behaved not as an activist but as a lawyer. His assignment came from the Bank of Italy. His responsibility was defined by law. His methods remained professional from beginning to end. He examined documents carefully, preserved evidence, cooperated with investigators when required, and resisted every attempt to compromise the independence of his work. Looking back, what remains remarkable is not that he uncovered evidence of fraud. Skilled professionals accomplish difficult investigations every day. What makes Ambrosoli exceptional is that he continued despite knowing the personal risks were increasing. The threats were not imaginary. Anonymous letters arrived. Telephone calls attempted to frighten him. Bribery offered an easier path. Political pressure encouraged compromise. None of these efforts altered the fundamental principle upon which he had built his career. The law could not function honestly if those responsible for applying it surrendered whenever powerful interests demanded silence. That principle appears simple when discussed in theory. In practice, it required extraordinary resolve. One of the most enduring images associated with Giorgio Ambrosoli is not the crime scene outside his apartment building, but the letter he wrote before his death. Those words continue to resonate because they were not written for history. They were written for his wife. They reflected the private thoughts of a man who understood that doing the right thing might carry irreversible consequences. Rather than asking whether the risk was worthwhile, he accepted that responsibility sometimes demands sacrifice beyond anything originally anticipated. The letter has since become a symbol because it captures something universal. Institutions depend upon laws, regulations, and procedures, but they also depend upon individuals willing to uphold those principles even when personal safety is no longer guaranteed. Without such people, legal systems become vulnerable to intimidation. Ambrosoli demonstrated that integrity is measured not by public declarations, but by daily decisions, made when no one is watching. His legacy therefore extends beyond Italy's legal history. It speaks to a broader truth about professional ethics. Whether someone works as a lawyer, judge, accountant, investigator, journalist, or public official, trust is earned through consistency. Giorgio Ambrosoli did not suddenly become honest during his final investigation. He had built that reputation over years of careful legal work. When extraordinary pressure finally arrived, his response remained consistent with the values that had always guided him. That consistency gave lasting credibility to everything he accomplished. Another lasting lesson concerns the nature of power itself. At first glance, the balance appeared hopelessly unequal. On one side stood influential financial figures connected to extensive networks of money and authority. On the other stood a single lawyer working through legal procedures and financial documents. Conventional wisdom might suggest that wealth and influence inevitably prevail. Yet history often produces a different outcome. Michelle Sindona once appeared enormously powerful, celebrated in financial circles, and connected to influential institutions. Giorgio Ambrosoli possessed none of that public prestige. Decades later, however, their names carry very different meanings. Sindona is remembered because of the crimes associated with his downfall. Ambrosoli is remembered because of the principles he refused to abandon. That contrast illustrates a deeper reality. Financial empires may rise and collapse. Political influence may shift from one generation to another. Criminal organizations may adapt and evolve. Integrity, however, possesses an unusual permanence because it is remembered through example rather than through wealth or authority. The murder that was intended to erase one man's work instead ensured that his commitment to justice would become impossible to forget. The creation of the 1995 film Un Ero Borghese reflected precisely this transformation. The title, meaning an ordinary hero, deliberately avoided portraying Ambrosoli as someone fundamentally different from everyone else. Instead, it emphasized that extraordinary courage often appears in ordinary people carrying out ordinary responsibilities. The film helped preserve public awareness of his story, introducing new generations to the lawyer whose determination exposed the dangerous intersection of finance, organized crime, and political influence. Yet perhaps the greatest memorial to Giorgio Ambrosoli is neither a film nor a legal judgment. It is the continuing recognition that the rule of law depends upon individuals willing to perform their duties honestly, even when honesty becomes uncomfortable, unpopular, or dangerous. Every society faces moments when personal convenience conflicts with professional responsibility. Ambrosoli's life reminds us that the choices made during those moments ultimately shape public trust, far more than speeches or slogans ever could. His investigation also demonstrated another essential lesson. Complex financial crimes often appear difficult to understand because they are hidden beneath technical language, corporate structures, and accounting practices unfamiliar to most people. That complexity can create the illusion that such crimes matter only to specialists. Ambrosoli's assassination shattered that illusion. It showed that financial corruption can affect society in profound ways, influencing institutions, encouraging organized criminal activity, and ultimately costing innocent lives. Behind every fraudulent transaction stands a moral decision made by individuals. And behind every effort to expose that fraud stands someone willing to accept responsibility for revealing the truth. As this story closes, it is worth remembering how quietly it began. There was no dramatic declaration of war against corruption. There was no promise to become a national hero. There was simply a lawyer accepting an assignment from the Bank of Italy in 1974. That assignment required him to determine why a bank had collapsed. Had he ignored inconsistencies, accepted bribery, or yielded to intimidation, history might never have remembered his name. Instead, he chose the more difficult path. He continued asking questions, continued examining evidence, and continued believing that professional responsibility demanded honesty regardless of the consequences. Those choices ultimately cost him his life, but they also ensured that his work survived him. The evidence remained. The investigation continued. The truth reached the courtroom. And the principles for which he stood became stronger precisely because others had tried to destroy them through violence. True crime stories often leave audiences searching for certainty, hoping every mystery will be solved and every injustice completely repaired. The murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli offers a more complicated ending. Justice was pursued. Those identified as responsible faced legal consequences. Yet no verdict could restore the years stolen from his family or erase the violence committed. Outside his home on that July evening, what remains instead is something less tangible, but perhaps more enduring. The example of a man who demonstrated that honesty retains its value even when dishonesty appears more profitable. That courage often reveals itself through quiet perseverance rather than dramatic acts, and that one individual's refusal to compromise can illuminate truths powerful enough to outlive fear itself. In the final measure, Giorgio Ambrosoli did not become a symbol because he sought greatness. He became a symbol because, when confronted with corruption, intimidation, and the possibility of personal sacrifice, he continued doing exactly what he believed the law required. Sometimes history remembers those who changed the world through extraordinary power. Sometimes it remembers those who possess no power at all except the determination to remain faithful to their conscience. Giorgio Ambrosoli belonged to the second group, and that is precisely why his story continues to matter. In the decades following the assassination of Giorgio Ambrosoli, Italy continued to grapple with the deeper implications of the case, not as a closed historical episode, but as a living reference point in discussions about corruption, institutional responsibility, and the vulnerability of those who investigate financial wrongdoing. Although the legal proceedings had formally concluded with the conviction of Michele Sindona as the individual responsible for ordering the murder, the broader questions raised by the case persisted in public discourse. The story of Ambrosoli became increasingly recognized not only as a criminal case, but as a moral reference for how institutions respond when confronted with individuals who choose integrity over compromise. Within legal and academic circles, the Ambrosoli case is frequently revisited as an example of the intersection between financial crime and organized criminal networks, particularly in how complex banking systems can be exploited to obscure illicit flows of money. The investigation he conducted into Banca Privata Italiana remains significant because it demonstrated, in concrete and documented form, how shell companies, falsified accounting records, and international financial transfers can operate together to conceal large-scale financial misconduct. Even though Ambrosoli himself was not a law enforcement officer, his work effectively functioned as a bridge between civil financial oversight and criminal investigation, revealing evidence that would later support broader judicial actions. Over time, his name became embedded in discussions about institutional ethics in Italy, especially in the training of lawyers, judges, and financial regulators. The letter he wrote to his wife before his death is often cited as a defining expression of professional responsibility under extreme pressure, not because it romanticizes sacrifice, but because it illustrates the internal conflict faced by individuals who understand that fulfilling legal duty may come at a personal cost. This document, preserved and widely referenced, has contributed to shaping public understanding of what it means to uphold the rule of law in environments where legal procedures alone may not guarantee safety. The cultural memory of Ambrosoli also expanded significantly through the 1995 film Un Ero Borghese, which translated his life into a narrative accessible to a broader audience. While the film necessarily interprets events through a cinematic lens, its core function in public consciousness was to reinforce the idea that systemic corruption is not an abstract concept, but something that can directly affect individuals who perform routine professional tasks with honesty. In this sense, the film did not simply recount a historical crime. It reinforced a societal message about the fragility of institutional integrity when confronted with concentrated financial and political power. In modern discussions of anti-corruption efforts, Ambrosoli's case is often referenced alongside other significant Italian investigations involving organized crime and financial misconduct, serving as a foundational example of the risks faced by those who expose hidden systems of influence. His murder is not viewed in isolation, but as part of a broader historical pattern in which individuals attempting to document or interrupt illicit financial structures have faced severe retaliation. This perspective has contributed to ongoing debates about the protection of whistleblowers, legal professionals, and financial investigators, emphasizing the need for stronger institutional safeguards to ensure that the pursuit of truth does not depend solely on individual courage. What remains particularly striking in retrospective analysis is how ordinary Ambrosoli's professional role initially appeared compared to the extraordinary consequences it eventually produced. He was not engaged in high-profile political confrontation or public activism. His work consisted of examining financial records, verifying transactions, and applying legal procedures to a failed banking institution. Yet the outcome of this work revealed that even the most technical forms of legal oversight can become central to exposing extensive networks of wrongdoing when financial systems are used to conceal illicit activity. This realization has had lasting implications for how financial regulation is understood in Italy and beyond, reinforcing the idea that transparency in banking systems is not merely an administrative requirement, but a fundamental component of public accountability. The case also continues to serve as a reminder of the human dimension behind institutional investigations. While much of the evidence in the Ambrosoli case involved documents, financial records, and legal procedures, the consequences were profoundly personal. A family lost a husband and father, and a professional community lost a colleague whose reputation had been built on trust and diligence. These human costs are frequently emphasized in modern reflections on the case, ensuring that it is not reduced to a purely technical discussion of financial crime or legal precedent. Instead, it remains anchored in the reality that institutional failures and criminal decisions ultimately affect individuals in deeply irreversible ways. Over time, Giorgio Ambrosoli has come to represent a form of integrity that is defined not by visibility or recognition, but by consistency under pressure. His legacy is often contrasted with the forces that opposed him, illustrating a broader historical lesson about the long-term consequences of corruption. While those involved in financial misconduct and criminal activity may temporarily achieve influence or conceal their actions, the persistence of documented evidence and institutional inquiry often ensures that such systems eventually come under scrutiny. Ambrosoli's work contributed directly to this process by preserving a detailed record that could be used even after his death, demonstrating that careful documentation is itself a form of resistance against concealment. In contemporary Italy, his name is frequently invoked in discussions about civic responsibility and ethical governance. Educational programs, legal institutions, and public commemorations reference his case not only to honor his memory, but to reinforce the principle that public trust depends on individuals who are willing to uphold legal standards even when doing so is personally disadvantageous. This continued relevance suggests that the impact of his work extends beyond the specific financial crimes he investigated, influencing broader cultural expectations about accountability and professional conduct. Ultimately, the enduring significance of Giorgio Ambrosoli lies in the way his story connects individual ethical choices to systemic consequences. His investigation into a single financial institution exposed networks that reached into international banking, organized crime, and political influence, while his assassination revealed the extreme measures that can be taken to protect such systems from exposure. Yet despite the violence that ended his life, the documentation he left behind ensured that the truth he uncovered remained accessible to investigators, courts, and the public. In this way, his legacy continues to function not only as a historical account, but as an ongoing reminder that the pursuit of truth within financial and legal systems often depends on the quiet persistence of individuals who choose to act with integrity even when no protection is guaranteed. As time passes, certain criminal cases stop belonging exclusively to the moment in which they occurred and begin to exist in a different form, shaped less by procedural records and more by collective memory. The assassination of Giorgio Ambrosoli has undergone precisely this transformation. While the legal system concluded its formal judgments years ago, the story itself has continued to evolve within public consciousness, becoming something that is repeatedly reinterpreted through changing social, political, and institutional contexts. What remains constant, however, is the central figure at its core, a lawyer whose professional duties led him into direct contact with some of the most opaque intersections of finance and power in modern Italian history, and who maintained his course despite escalating pressure that ultimately cost him his life. In institutional discussions, the case is often treated as a reference point for understanding how financial systems can become entangled with broader networks of influence that extend beyond traditional banking activity. The investigation Ambrosoli, conducted into Banca Privata Italiana, continues to be cited as an example of how complex financial structures, when built on layers of transactions, corporate entities, and cross-border movements, can obscure the true origin and destination of large sums of money. What made his work particularly significant was not only the discoveries themselves, but the methodical way in which those discoveries were documented. Every conclusion he reached was anchored in records, correspondence, and financial analysis that could be independently examined. This emphasis on verifiable evidence ensured that his findings retained their value long after his death, allowing subsequent legal and investigative processes to rely on his work as a foundation rather than as interpretation. Over time, Ambrosoli's name has become closely associated with the ethical dimension of financial oversight. In professional environments where lawyers, accountants, and regulators are trained, his case is frequently referenced as a demonstration of the responsibilities inherent in roles that involve public trust. The central lesson drawn from his experience is not simply that corruption exists, but that the act of documenting and exposing it can carry profound personal consequences when the interests involved are sufficiently powerful. This creates a moral tension that continues to be discussed in legal education. The expectation that professionals must remain independent and thorough in their work, even when the systems they are examining resist transparency. Within this framework, Ambrosoli's decision to continue his investigation despite repeated threats, attempts at bribery, and sustained pressure becomes more than a historical detail. It becomes a case study in professional ethics under conditions of extreme risk. His refusal to abandon the liquidation process of Banca Privata Italiana is often interpreted not as an act of defiance in the political sense, but as a strict adherence to the obligations of his role. That distinction is important in understanding why his legacy has endured. He did not redefine his profession. He fulfilled it with a consistency that exposed the limits of institutional protection when confronted with determined efforts to obstruct accountability. The preservation of his written work, including detailed financial analysis and the documented threats he received, has contributed significantly to the longevity of his impact. Unlike many cases where key evidence is fragmented or lost over time, the material associated with Ambrosoli's investigation remains sufficiently intact to continue informing later analysis. This has allowed historians, legal scholars, and policymakers to revisit the case repeatedly, each time extracting new implications depending on the evolving understanding of financial crime and institutional vulnerability. In this sense, his work continues to function as both historical record and analytical framework. At the same time, the narrative surrounding his assassination has gradually taken on symbolic dimensions that extend beyond the specific facts of the case. The image of an individual confronting opaque financial systems without institutional protection has become a recurring motif in discussions about accountability. However, this symbolic interpretation does not replace the factual core of the case. Rather, it builds upon it. The documented sequence remains unchanged. A lawyer appointed to investigate a bank collapse uncovered extensive irregularities, faced escalating pressure, and was ultimately murdered as his work approached completion. What evolves is the meaning assigned to those facts as society reflects on them over time. The case also continues to be examined in relation to broader questions about the relationship between financial systems and public institutions. While Ambrosoli's investigation was focused on a specific bank, the evidence he uncovered pointed toward a wider environment in which financial operations, corporate structures, and influential networks could intersect in ways that were difficult to trace without sustained and detailed inquiry. This aspect of the case has contributed to ongoing discussions about the importance of transparency in financial systems and the need for mechanisms that allow independent professionals to conduct investigations without fear of retaliation. Even though such discussions extend beyond the specific timeline of the case, they remain anchored in the documented reality of what occurred during Ambrosoli's work and the consequences he faced as a result. Another dimension of the case's long-term significance lies in the way it reshaped public perception of professional risk. Before Ambrosoli's assassination, the dangers associated with financial investigations were not widely understood outside specialized circles. His death altered that perception by demonstrating that even roles perceived as technical or administrative could place individuals in direct confrontation with powerful interests. This realization has influenced how institutions think about protection, oversight, and the responsibilities associated with public service roles that involve exposure to sensitive financial information. In many respects, the case has become a reference point for understanding the boundaries between professional duty and personal safety, highlighting the fact that those boundaries are not always clearly defined in practice. The passage of time has also contributed to the formation of a dual narrative around Giorgio Ambrosoli, one rooted in documented historical events and another shaped by collective interpretation. The historical narrative is defined by evidence, court proceedings, financial records, and investigative findings. The collective narrative is shaped by reflection on what those events represent within broader societal contexts. These two narratives do not contradict each other. Instead, they coexist, reinforcing different aspects of the same story. The documented facts establish what happened. The evolving interpretation explores why it matters. Together, they ensure that the case remains relevant long after its immediate legal consequences have concluded. Ultimately, the enduring presence of Giorgio Ambrosoli in public memory is not the result of a deliberate effort to create symbolism, but rather the consequence of a sequence of events in which professional integrity, financial complexity, and institutional pressure converged in a way that produced lasting historical significance. His work exposed systems that might otherwise have remained obscured. His death revealed the potential consequences of that exposure, and the continued attention given to his case reflects an ongoing effort to understand how such outcomes can occur within structures designed to uphold legality and accountability. In this sense, the story does not function as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing point of reference, repeatedly revisited whenever questions arise about the responsibilities of professionals operating within complex financial systems. Giorgio Ambrosoli's legacy persists, not because it offers simple answers, but because it continues to pose difficult questions about integrity, about power, and about the cost of ensuring that the truth is not left buried beneath systems designed to conceal it.